Thank you very much and good evening. Like the other delegates here, I'm deeply concerned about proposed changes that will further limit public input with respect to decision-making at this board. These changes, though shocking, are ultimately consistent with a pattern of governance at the WRDSB that seems at its core rooted in disregard or even contempt for the public. I won't spend time outlining the proposed changes. Others have done that very effectively, as it turns out, and you could read them for yourselves. But the overall tenor, and I believe the predictable outcome of these changes, is oriented towards further isolating the board from public scrutiny. Now, I should start by saying that I have a certain amount of sympathy for the board here, and I can even understand the defensive impulse to protect oneself, one's social tribe, and one's deeply held beliefs from being challenged. And I think that the twin motivations, perhaps, of one, social conformity, and two, protecting deeply held moral beliefs, may well be at the heart of the impulse to circle the wagons, turn inward, and view your critics not just as misinformed, but as somehow morally defective. To first address the issue of social conformity, I'm often struck by the remarkable levels of partisan agreement at board meetings. Even for the most incomprehensible and Byzantine motions, one can predict an 8-3 vote with almost 100% accuracy. Social conformity is such that trustees sometimes appear to wait and see how others will vote before doing so themselves. This powerful, evolved desire to socially conform is exemplified by the Ash experiment of 1951. In this experiment, a lone subject, along with 7 actors pretending to be co-subjects, was presented with a straight line and asked to identify which of 3 other straight lines matched the length of the first line. The answer was obvious, but all the actors all selected the same obviously wrong answer. The fake subject's behavior influenced 3/4 of real subjects to conform at least once, and about 1/3 conformed most of the time. Afterwards, most subjects admitted to not believing their answers, but went along for fear of ridicule. They were afraid of not fitting in with complete strangers. Now imagine how much more pressure is brought to bear when you're expected to conform to your group. This underscores how willingly we bend our beliefs to fit in. We have evolved to conform to the beliefs of our tribe because social isolation has been, through most of our evolutionary history, quite literally a death sentence. As the writer Jonathan Rauch describes it, quote, "Wrong beliefs and wrong perceptions are contagious, whether or not they are sincere, because dissidents tend to self-censor and act like believers. That is how entire societies, like the Soviet Union, can be built on everyone's publicly pretending to believe what many privately know to be false. After a while, in a community where people are struggling to conform with each other, it can be hard, even in principle, to know whether people are sincere or faking, or even which is which." This brings me to what I think may be the second motivation for the board's retreat from public scrutiny: a puritanical adherence to and defense of a belief system. There is an ever-widening gulf between the beliefs of the board and those of the public. This divergence has been documented by political scientist Eric Kaufman, who recently showed that Canadians are overall, by a 2-to-1 margin, opposed to the social justice worldview that now dominates institutions like this board. For example, from the report, quote, "Canadians oppose the idea of separating students in schools by race into privileged and oppressed by 92-8. This is an astonishing level of agreement. You probably can't get 92% agreement on whether the Earth orbits the sun or whether Tim Hortons sells donuts. Yet we see the unmistakable hallmarks of critical race theory through concepts like white privilege and racially segregated events. Introduced under the guise of equity and inclusion, in reality, these events necessitate inequitable allocation of resources and exclude students of other races." In his 2022 book, The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World, writer Andrew Doyle remarks, quote, "Fear of miscegenation and interaction between racial groups has always been the backbone of racist orthodoxy. This has not changed simply because some of its advocates package their retrograde beliefs as progressive. If one were to deliberately construct an ideology intended to foster racial division and popularize the objectives of the far right, one could hardly do better than equity and inclusion. As another example, the board's equity and inclusion officer opined on Twitter, quote, WPs, meaning white people, are scared right now. History is paved with white-led violence, almost always in the name of freedom. It's hard to imagine how maligning an entire ethnic group could plausibly represent a successful strategy to endear oneself in the public eye. A truly anti-racist board might immediately fire such a person, but it is more likely that someone complaining about such racism would be slandered by the board as racists themselves. That Canadians are so overwhelmingly opposed to the re-racialization of society, but are afraid of voicing opposition for fear of being called racist, helps us understand why the board might want to censor this opinion and attempt to create an illusion of consensus. Faced with the choice of course correcting or doubling down, the board is doubling down by further closing off the few remaining avenues available for sampling discordant viewpoints. As another example of the board adhering to an unpopular belief, the Kaufman report states, quote, respondents by a 2-to-1 ratio want parents informed when children under 16 change pronouns at school. Policy AP 1235, which directs staff to not inform parents, is again at odds with public sentiment. When parents repeatedly receive no substantive responses from staff, they naturally organize protests like the Million March for Children. And rather than listen and respectfully engage in dialogue, our director instead resorts to ad hominem, dismissing parents as bigots motivated by hate. Somehow we found ourselves in the unusual circumstance where at least 2/3 of the country is now considered far right. So what is to be done? Well, I have some suggestions for how the board might re-engage the public in good faith. First and most obviously, you might have some humility towards those with few letters after their names. Sometimes they know things too, and especially they know and love their own children more than anyone. There is no harm in hearing views you disagree with. If a delegate is right, you might learn something and are granted an opportunity to revise your position. If a delegate is wrong, you'll better understand your own position and can more effectively persuade those holding opposing views. Furthermore, if your aim is to persuade, we know that censorship doesn't work. You may consider free speech or gender-critical views to be hateful, but banning them persuades nobody out of those views. Second, I would ask that you simply respond to delegations. Currently, delegating is much like speaking into a void, but this could be improved by issuing a public response posted online. This would transparently articulate the board's position and help the public understand both sides of the issue. And third, harm should no longer be invoked as a legitimate reason for censorship. It is not legitimate. Harm is unworkable in principle. It's a subjective standard conveniently conjured by governments to silence citizens. If the board's position is so obviously correct, the board only stands to benefit from the public airing of the weak arguments of its opponents. In closing, I believe the two key motivations for restricting public input are one, social conformity, which is driving out independent thought, and two, an inalterable adherence to a puritanical belief system, many tenets of which cannot withstand the most basic scrutiny. Our way out of this dysfunction can be found not in further retreat, but rather by walking towards one another in a spirit of openness. Many of us want to work with you. We want to mend the divide. I myself would be happy to meet with any of you, and I'd gladly volunteer to serve in any capacity that can help restore public trust in the board. After all, we all have a stake in public education, and the more hands on deck, so much the better. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you appreciate the work that I do, please consider supporting me financially. I'm very happy to speak up for the protection of kids, and if you can't support financially, I would appreciate it if you help me overcome the censorship and just share these videos with other people so they know exactly what is happening. I left a link in the description to my Ko-fi account where you can do a one-time donation or a monthly subscription. Anything helps and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you once again.